Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about cancer and how these cells basically violate the controls of the cell cycle. And sadly, we've all been affected by cancer in our family and friends. These are just a few of my friends. So Eric and Katie are no longer with us as they lost their battle to cancer last year. And then my friend Fred and my little friend Taylor are still fighting their cancers, and so hopefully they will be able to hold on, and who knows what their future will hold. Let's talk about the science of cancer. So your cells divide. Different types of cells divide different ways, and your body has ways to keep that division in control. And so we don't want it to just divide out of control to where it just keeps dividing and dividing and dividing. And so some of the ways that we control the cell cycle is through external factors. A couple of external factors for the cell is cell kind of contact and growth. Cells don't like to be overcrowded, and so once they kind of start touching each other, they'll oftentimes stop dividing. So if we have like a petri dish with cells here, and it spreads out, and once we get that, cells oftentimes will not grow then on top of each other in that controlled environment, and they'll stop dividing. That external factor causes that. But in a cancerous cell, they'll keep going and going and going. They can kind of override that external growth factor. Another one is the growth factors themselves, and so these are oftentimes chemical signals that will be released by the cell, and that tells other cells to grow. So when you get a cut, you release platelets, and so you grow as many platelets as you can quickly to help stop the bleeding and to help replenish the platelets that were used in the bleeding. Another thing is called erythropoietin. This is a case where we will sometimes cause cells to grow based on the environment. So for example, if you are training in a high altitude environment, you need more blood cells to transport more oxygen because of the low oxygen. Then your body will start to grow blood cells, red blood cells. And so it provides the growth factors needed to kind of override the cell cycle and grow more red blood cells. Hormones are another way that certain times in an organism's life, then it will start to grow different things, and so it helps regulate muscle and fat growth then based on these growth factors. But those are all external. Then internal factors are going to be used what's called kinesis and cyclins, and so these cyclins are a group of proteins that we just rapidly make and destroy, and then they will hook on then to the enzyme, the kinase, that can transfer this phosphate to a target molecule, and it causes the change of the shape. And so this can help regulate the cell cycle and when to pass checkpoints or not. And so these would be what we would call internal factors that would help regulate the cell cycle growth. Sometimes cells need to grow and divide, and then other times it's time to die. And the cell needs to be destroyed. And so this happens with old cells, kind of a self-destruct button, when it's time for those to go, and then we can regenerate new cells. But then also sometimes in a developmental thing. So when you were born, you had skin tissue develop between like your toes and fingers, and then those cells were programmed to die then as you were being developed prenatally. If somebody doesn't have the growth factor hormones needed to cause that apoptosis, then that webbing might exist after birth then. And so that programmed cell death is called apoptosis. And so just like we said, sometimes it's time for a cell to grow, and then sometimes it's time for the cell to die. But cancer is basically a way of the cell getting around these growth factors and these checkpoints and these controls. And so it's just uncontrolled cell division. So it just goes through that cell cycle, just around and around and around and again. And so this uncontrolled cell division creates these clusters of cells called tumors. And so when there's a tumor that kind of stays clustered and remains relatively together and intact, that is what's called a benign tumor. But when the cancer cells start to break away from the tumor and start to move, that's called them being metastasized. They will oftentimes be carried by the bloodstream or lymphatic system to a different part in the body, and then those cells will start to grow as well. And so when we use terminology like the cancer is spreading, then that means the cancer has been metastasized and carried to another part of the body. So what exactly is bad about the tumors? Well, these are cells that are growing really, really fast, super fast compared to the regular body cells. And so they're using up a lot of nutrients and a lot of resources, and they're not doing anything in return. So if they're taking up space in the lungs, then that means good lung cells don't have resources or space to grow and bring in oxygen. So here you have these bad cells that are doing nothing to help the body out, but in hindsight, they're actually using up a lot more resources because they're controlling, or they're dividing so uncontrolled. So that's why they are bad. What causes them? We don't know exactly. Some of it, the more we understand about genetics, the more we realize that there are some people that are just predisposed to different types of cancer more likely. Radiation is another type. So sometimes if you're disposed, like at the Chernobyl disaster in Russia in the 80s, people got cancer from that radiation exposure. There were cancer exposures to the radiation on the atomic bombs dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Carcinogens are chemicals that help promote cancer growth. And so, things like tobacco and smoking would be these types of carcinogens. And so at some point in time, the cell mutates and becomes uncontrollable in the cell division cycle. And we don't know why the genetics allowed the carcinogen or the radiation or whatever to mutate those cells, but they did. And if it's mutated, there's really no blueprint. It was just kind of a freak once in a lifetime mutation. And we have cells that mutate all the time, but typically they mutate in a way that they die and they can't survive. But in the rare occasion, a cancer cell mutates in a way that it starts to do its uncontrolled cell division. So how do we combat that? Well, different types of treatment, and there's lots of foundations and places that are collect money to try and promote cancer research and different types of treatments to help try and battle and bring some victories over cancer. One of them is the V Foundation. You should have a video clip on that. Jimmy Valvano was a head coach of North Carolina State, a very charismatic, dynamic person that came down with cancer. And so he started the V Foundation upon his death, and to this day it's raised millions of dollars for cancer research. Another one is the Stand Up to Cancer. And so this is comedians and celebrities that donate to this Stand Up to Cancer Foundation that also collects money for cancer research and treatment. So what are some of the treatments and the ways that we try and look? Well, the two main ones would be radiation and chemotherapy. And so radiation, which seems a little ironic since radiation was causing mutations, but we're going to use radiation that's localized. So, if you have skin cancer in a certain spot, we're not going to do it all over your body, just that certain spot. And that will hopefully cause those cancer cells to die. Same thing with chemotherapy. This would be chemicals, drugs that you would take, and that would go throughout your body and again, hopefully target those cancer cells. Now, the problem with both of these is they are going to cause healthy cells to die as well. But remember, your body has a blueprint for those healthy cells to rebuild those and to regrow healthy cells. But that cancer was a mutation, so there was no blueprint. That was just a freak mutation. that the genetics just showed up one day. And so if we can get it all, then that mutation, in theory, will never show up again. And so that's the concept behind that. So usually radiation and chemotherapy are used in some sort of conjuncture with each other. And hopefully the idea would be to get all of the cancer cells. That is very difficult. And so sometimes we get most of them, but the cells kind of go into remission. We say the cancer is gone mostly. But then after time passes, those cells have started to uncontrollably divide again, and the cancer returns. And so that's just one type of treatment. Some research that we're doing is on HeLa cells. And so HeLa cells were cervical cancer cells that were back in the 50s by a lady, Henrietta Lacks. And so these same cells have just been perpetually grown for that amount of time, almost 70 years now. And so we're trying to use cancer cells to understand how they work. How do they work? How do they grow against things like radiation and chemotherapy? And so this source of cells is really, been used a lot in cancer research. Another thing in your reading on page 139 talks about elephants. And so typically larger animals get cancer more because you're dividing cells way more. So that would make sense that some of those divisions would mutate and maybe turn into cancer. But elephants do not have as much cancer as what, say, humans would have. And so researchers are kind of tracing that back to a particular gene called the TP53 gene that they have more copies of than what we as humans do. And so this gene, they think, might be part of what allows elephants to relatively be cancer-free compared to their size, compared with other animals that are smaller than them. So that is a little bit about cancer, and hopefully that helps you understand kind of how it is formed and how it does its thing. And hopefully someday we can not have to talk about this anymore because we have defeated it in a way that it is gone. So hope that was helpful.